You're gonna die for that!
I doubt it, punk.
Who does this guy think he is? Your big sword won't save you, tough guy! Come on! Let's get him, boys!
In the December of 1999 is when Sword of the Berserk would reach store shelves in Japan. This would be months ahead of its English release, which would come spring the following year. It was developed by Yuke's, a developer whose portfolio will consist of wrestling games, more wrestling games, a shit ton more wrestling games. I can't really find much about official sales figures for this game, but it was followed by another Berserk game made by Yuke's a few years later, so I'm going to assume it's sold enough. What's especially interesting about the game is not just the fact that it was a Sega Dreamcast exclusive, but also the fact that it was released in English years ahead of the original manga being released in English, or even the anime getting an English release. Now, it's not entirely crazy that it got an English release. I couldn't really find anything online that gave an official answer to this. Most likely, English publisher Eidos simply needed something to fill their schedule, but for most people at the time who would have bought this, they either only knew about Berserk because of unofficial fan translations that were circling on dial-up internet, or they simply just didn't know this was based on an anime at all. And the only thing to fill in the blanks of the story, since this story was written to fit into official canon, would be a appendix section in the game's menu. Although it's very doubtful that most people actually went and looked at this, because that's not why they bought the game. Berserk, realistically speaking, has only really gained a lot more popularity in the West over the past few years. And that's largely because of the internet, fan communities, a better accessibility of the manga, and more tragically, the passing of the original author and illustrator Kentaro Miura.
I'm not a bug, I'm an elf! An elf, damn it! Haven't you ever seen an elf? I'm the adorable Puck! This mean-looking guy is Gatsu. He's my buddy and carries my house, you could say.
Oh!
And that's our Casca.
The way I could summarize the characters very quickly to anyone who has never read Berserk and probably won't, is that Guts is cursed, Casca has been mentally regressed, and Puck...
Come on, come on, come on. I wanna go. We both wanna go. Please, please, please. Oh, please, come on, let us go. Let's live a little. Come on, Gatsu. Please.
My name is Rita. I'm a traveling performer. We're going to give a performance in the next town. Why don't you come and watch? Hey, Job! You help too. After all, you're as strong as 2 men.
I only got a glance, but I'm sure that guy in the wagon... That's the guy.
He's possessed by the Mandragora! Damn monster!
The Mandra what?
Foul beast!
John, no!
Stop!
He didn't do anything wrong. You didn't have to kill him.
I don't feel any mercy for monsters.
These huge sword wounds. Was it you? Did you do this?
Yeah.
I'm Balzac, ruler of this town. Unfortunately, once people with this disease run amok, they rampage until they die. The plants attach and inject a poison that drives people mad, but yet it cures all illness in the host body. Legend has it that the plant has the ability to also cure the infected and bestow the benefits of youth and vigor. The legend is true. However, when you pull it from the earth, it dies immediately. To refine serum, you need a Mandragora heart.
Heart.
When a mandragora plant grows into a great tree, it gains a heart. Even when cut out, it does not die, but instead starts to regenerate. The drug made from such a heart would allow us to cure this cursed mandragora possession. I've sent my soldiers to the village countless times since then to get the heart of the great tree, but not a single one has returned alive. But we desperately need it for our research. I've seen your abilities, Gatsu. I have a job for you.
A job?
Infiltrate the Mandragora village and take the heart of the great tree. As compensation, we will heal your female companion.
I don't trust you, Balzac. I sense that you're not coming clean with me on this. But I'll do it. For my Casca.
Combat of Sword of the Berserk is pretty basic, but also does yield some of the game's flaws. You have two buttons to attack, an overhead slash and a side slash, which you can create a combo with. This is actually pretty good, and can be very satisfying when you're fighting against large hordes of enemies. If you endure enough damage or get enough hits, you'll fill up a red bar, which I presume is supposed to be Gatsu's rage, but when you fill this bar up, it'll basically lead to a state of temporary invulnerability, where you'll be slashing through the enemies much easier, and also adding the gore factor in the game. When you're in this state, you won't take damage, although enemies can still knock you back, and in place of taking damage, your rage meter will deplete faster. Combat can sometimes be avoided, sometimes it can't, and you have to fight the whole area of enemies before you can progress. Now, the biggest flaw with the combat is to do with Gatsu's sword, in that you will often end up hitting the wall with the sword, which will cause Gatsu to be stunned for a second, which will lead to enemies getting an easy opening. Now, you're probably just thinking to yourself, oh well, I just won't hit the wall then, and that would be easier if not for the fact that a lot of enemies will, especially projectile enemies, will stay very close to the wall. Meaning that there are quite a few enemies that you can't do damage to without hitting it. And there are a lot of spaces in the game which are very enclosed and claustrophobic, which makes doing damage without hitting the walls on accident very difficult. And even when you are in larger spaces, projectile enemies still prove to be a huge problem because of the limitations of the game's camera, meaning you'll be shot at by bullets that you can't dodge because you can't see on camera the enemy that's shooting at you. And of course, the large group of enemies ganging up on you in later parts of the game does make it a bit harder to swing your sword around, or at least control where your sword's swinging at. That's not to say the game can't be fun, but it certainly adds to the game's difficulty. In fairness, you can manage with your health, which you do get health items in the game. Probably one of the most antiquated things though is the use of a continue system. You have about 10 continues, if I recall, on the normal difficulty, and once all those continues run out, it's game over and you start at the beginning of the stage, of which there are 4 stages. You can save the game at any time, which you do either by losing all your lives or choosing to quit in the menu, which was a bit confusing to me at the beginning because I didn't really know how to save when I first started up the game. Now, the fact that you can only save at stages, continues are a very antiquated thing of the 8 and 16-bit era, not for a time when games were using save memory cards, and effectively is just a cheap way of sending weaker players back to bosses. Yeah, this is a very short game. If you're a much skilled player than most people, and you were to skip over the cutscenes, you would basically have like an hour or an hour and a half of game at best. On one hand, that could be seen as a good thing. For the sake of brevity, it stops the game from becoming repetitive and stale, but it also really stops the game from feeling like a game, and more so a collection of cutscenes with slashy bits. And believe me, the cutscenes are very well done for the time, and they certainly do give the game a sense of scale, but I guess the brevity also makes the story feel like something that would be more suited for like an OVA or an episode of the anime than a full priced game. Doing some research, I did find that there were quite a few differences between the English and Japanese release of the game though. Not just the box art, which the Japanese art is the best, American art is very of its time, and the European art is, oh, they didn't even try with this. Also notable changes is that they made the game a bit harder, probably because Japan, unlike the West, doesn't have game rentals. Another thing was more blood and gore than the original Japanese release, owing to probably more lax standards in the West to this. One thing of particular high praise I can give is that the voice acting is good. Really good actually for the time, which may not sound like it's saying much unless you consider the low bar of entry for voice acting in video games at the time.
How do you know about the three blades?
Years ago, I was Chinese.
To protect the life cycle, I have made a creature to rule over mankind.
Cast members include Michael Bell as Guts, who you might recognize is also the voice of Raziel from the Legacy of Kain series, which makes sense considering both of these games were published by Eidos in the West. Other inclusions include Cam Clark, aka Raiden from MGS2, as Puck, and probably the strongest performance is definitely the late Earl Bone as Balzac, who you might recognize for his small part in some of the Terminator movies. Now to talk about the bosses. It was really just a case of swing my sword a bit, take a bit of damage, and then take some health potion, because honestly, when I started a boss battle with full health and 2 potions, I just generally felt like I had enough to fight them with. I think the only really one I had to really use strategy for was Zod and also the Mandragora, where I had to learn the right moments to dodge, but even then the boss parts aren't really that hard. Speaking of which, probably one of the more disappointing bosses in the game definitely has to be Zod. Well, disappointing and also one of the better bosses, because while he is a pretty good challenge to fight against when you first play against him, overall his part in the story is very lackluster. He basically just appears as a Deus Ex Machina that conveniently gets Casca and Puck out of jail when they're imprisoned. Guts fights him, Guts wins, and then he just disappears from the story. But of course, probably one of the worst sections isn't the bosses. They all pale in comparison to probably the worst section of the game, where Gatsu has to escape the Mandragora roots that are chasing after him, in a section which consists of Gatsu running forward and avoiding vines that will trip him up. This is absolutely the worst section of the game, because it's essentially one of those sections where you actually have to be really perfect, or you might as well basically consider yourself lost immediately. You have to either be absolutely perfect, or you lose a life, mainly due to the game's knockback, how fast the roots move, and the camera. Oh god. This is fucking awful. I didn't like this shit when I had to do it in Crash Bandicoot, and I certainly don't like it when I have to do it in a Berserk game. It's just incredibly cheap, and if you lose all your lives on this, you have to go back and fight Balzac again at the beginning of the stage. It's just absolutely cheap shit. But yeah, I got past it. Without giving too much away about the story, I think there is a really great parallel with Balzac's story to that of Guts, which is revealed much later in the game. Speaking of which, this is also one of the earliest games to feature QuickTime events, ironically coming out the same month in Japan as Shenmue, and several months ahead of the Western release. And to be honest, I think the QuickTime events are not that bad. They will either do one of two things. Either you miss them and you lose a life, or you miss them and it'll lead you down an alternate route, albeit probably a more challenging one. And honestly, I think this was a pretty interesting way of doing things. I beat the game on normal and I unlocked a battle arena mode. Nothing really to write home about, but I guess there is more to unlock if you beat the game on the easy and hard modes. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It's a short game that never really outstays its welcome, but it also feels a bit too short that it makes me feel like there could have been more. Any diehard fan will want to play, but it also feels like they're not really missing out if they're only watching the YouTube cutscenes. And from what I've been told, a lot of the problems with the game would later be addressed in Yuke's follow-up. Although this is not an original story, it's just retelling of stuff from the manga. And also this game was never released outside of Asia, although there are fan translations floating about if you're looking in the right places. The only other Berserk game would come from Koei Tecmo, would be Berserk and the Band of the Hawk. And it's a Dynasty Warriors game. That's really it. You've basically played it if you've played any other, X-Thing Warriors title. So there's really no point for me to give any review. Overall, I'd give a pretty cautious recommendation to Sword of the Berserk. It's a game that I could definitely say you can play once, but there's really no reason for me to revisit it. Oh my god, the villagers don't have eyes!